So this is part of the Conference on Indonesian Foreign Policy, or CIFP 2022. So again, welcome. Please have a seat. We will begin the session shortly. And before that, let me also welcome our university partners, students from UPN Veteran. Where are you? Are you here? Okay, welcome. And then my students from Binus University. Are you here? None of them are here. Let me take a note. But I see Pelita Harapan University as well. Welcome, students, professors, practitioners, enthusiasts. And to begin, let me now welcome on stage our panelists. The first is His Excellency R.M. Michael Tene, Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN for Political Security Community. Welcome, sir. Let's give a warm round of applause. Second is Professor Gordon Flake, CEO of Perth, U.S. Asia Center. We will remember him as the professor with the most colorful shirt. He says it best represents Western Australia. Next, we will welcome on stage Professor Richard Javad Haydarian, Senior Lecturer from the ASEAN Center. He also has a colorful tie, flying all the way from the Philippines. And last but not least, a fellow economist, Dr. Jose Rizal Damuri, Executive Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS Indonesia. So when we talk about centrality of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, we will of course have to refer or look at it, discuss it from the point of view of the changing geopolitical landscape. And with that, perhaps I would like to invite His Excellency Bapak Michael Tene to perhaps say a few words about how ASEAN thinks, how ASEAN positions itself, and then we move forward to the other panelists. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Well, the topic for today is about ASEAN Centrality, great power rivalry, and the race of minilateralism. So I will address those three issues. Briefly, ASEAN Centrality is actually about the way of how ASEAN protect and promote its interests vis-a-vis the interests of other partners. It entails ASEAN unity and cohesiveness. It entails ASEAN's independency in crafting its policy and making its decisions. And third, it entails ASEAN capabilities of identifying areas of shared interest with its partners and to rally those partners to work together based on those shared interests. So these are in a nutshell what ASEAN Centrality is all about, at least from my point of view, because I have to admit that there are many ways, of course, to define what ASEAN or to elaborate what ASEAN Centrality is all about. The second question about the race of the great power rivalries. Of course, everyone here very much aware that the relationship between the major powers, especially between US, China, and Russia, has been deteriorating in the past few years. But for ASEAN, the issue of major power relations is not something new. It is something that we have always anticipate and be prepared of. We look back in 1994, we established the ASEAN Regional Forum. In 2005, the East Asia Summit. In 2011, the expansion of East Asia Summit to include Russia and the United States. These are all efforts by ASEAN to engage its partners, especially the major powers, and to deal with whatever implication arise from the state of their relationships, especially in its impact to our region. And recently, we are also aware that ASEAN has come out with the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, which is another strategic framework from ASEAN on how to deal with the major power relations. In a nutshell, the AOIP is about ASEAN's effort to promote or to underline the shared values, shared norms, to shared interests, and to promote cooperation vis-a-vis the deteriorating relations between the major power. I can elaborate later if there's any questions on that.
Thank you.
And lastly is about the minilateralism. Well, the point here is that the ASEAN-led regional mechanisms is established from the point of view of ASEAN's interest, plus the shared interest with its partners. The ASEAN-led regional mechanism is not designed to fulfill all the interests of our partners. So we have to be realistic that there are some interests of our partners that cannot be accommodated through the ASEAN-led regional mechanism. The important thing here is that the minilateralisms and the ASEAN-led regionalism should complement one another rather than canceling out one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Pa. And let me go to Professor Gordon Flake.
Well, thank you. It is absolutely wonderful to be back at this conference for the first time in 3 years and back in Jakarta. Let me say it is also good to see the red jackets of the students from UTA 45. I had a chance to visit their university yesterday. I come from Western Australia, from Perth, which sits on Australia's Indian Ocean side. You are probably used to thinking of Australia as an Asia-Pacific country or a power in Oceania or the Pacific. But we have an Indian Ocean side, and that's where I'm coming from. So I want to make just 2 points today. If you remember nothing else that I say today, number one, I want you to remember that the Indo-Pacific as a region is different than Indo-Pacific strategies. One is a region, one is a strategy. And we tend to confuse these together. We think of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. We think of the Quad. We think of AUKUS. We think of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Just in Cambodia this last week, Korea announced an Indo-Pacific strategy. So has Canada, so has Germany, so has Europe. Obviously, so has Australia. Those are strategies for the region. They are not the region. Number one point. Second point is that the region itself is not firmly defined. When I began my professional career over 30 years ago, nobody used the term Asia-Pacific. We talked about East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Australia was part of this mystical land of Oceania, hanging out by Atlantis and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. It wasn't until the late 1980s when Korea and Japan decided they wanted to integrate south into Southeast Asia, and Australia and New Zealand in particular decided they wanted to be part of Asia and integrate north. And that began the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative. And for the last 30 years, we use the term Asia-Pacific. But there's a problem with the Asia-Pacific. It's missing something. It's missing India. So at its core, the Indo-Pacific is how do you incorporate India into the Asia-Pacific. That's it. Now today, in 2022, there is no firm definition for what includes the Asia-Pacific. Some countries, some versions and some organizations include South America's, East, West Coast countries, North America's, etc. Others do not. The same thing is true. Japan's view of the Indo-Pacific, Indonesia's, India's, Australia's, the US, they may be slightly different. That doesn't matter. At its core, it's about how do you incorporate India into the Asia-Pacific, and it includes obviously Japan, Australia, India, and at the center of it all is Southeast Asia, or ASEAN. So that's the core. We'll get into conversation now in the future about strategies for that, but again, distinguish between the region and the strategies, and understand that it is not a firm geographic grouping. There are many different definitions.
Thank you. And let me invite Professor Richard Hidarian.
Yeah, good morning. Terima kasih for that. It's always a pleasure to be here. Sorry, it's morning. It's not my best time. I'll try to be quick about it. Since I only have 3 minutes, maybe you can just buy my book on the Indo-Pacific, which more or less covers everything. And I'm still rewriting different versions of that book. I'm sure a pirated version should be somewhere there in the internet for free. Very quickly, as far as ASEAN Centrality is concerned, let's be brutally honest about it. It's an aspiration rather than a geopolitical reality. And throughout the half a century history of ASEAN, sometimes we were closer to embodying that aspiration and sometimes we were not, right? So to say that, I mean, to try to shove it down, the throat of other countries and say ASEAN is central and it should be central, I think is not enough. We cannot just assert it, we have to embody it. And I think the rise of the quadrilateral security dialogue is both an opportunity and it's also a challenge. It's a challenge in the sense that I think it has sent some signals to many here in this part of the world. I remember the first time I used the term Indo-Pacific and I was trying to seek some people to review my book, right? Including this guy who was too busy for it. They were actually skeptical of the term Indo-Pacific because they confused it with the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Quad. But my point is, that's exactly the point. It is a challenge to ASEAN to step up to the game, right? Because the idea is, if ASEAN doesn't hold the line, if ASEAN doesn't make sure that it effectively mediates relations among major powers, then the so-called big boys are going to come in and take care of the day. Obviously, we know that our Quad friends will always deny that. I remember Jai Shankar earlier this year, I asked him in the Munich Secret Conference, is Quad a NATO with Asian characteristic or an Asian NATO? And he was like pissed off and he went all over the place, right? But my point is, whether Quad is an Asian NATO or not doesn't matter. What matters is what we do with this new era of opportunities and challenges. And in my opinion, ASEAN multilateralism has its place, has its value. ASEAN multilateralism is what allowed us to bring 10 extremely diverse countries. Are we 10 still? Or 11 or 9, depending on. That was great. But the reality is that this is not 1970s, this is not 1990s. Vietnam, the communist countries are already here. We have a very diverse grouping. But in my opinion, ASEAN multilateralism is sometimes, especially on sensitive security and defense issues, which are inherently divisive, right? And where there are very diverse threat perceptions, is a recipe for paralysis. Because our understanding of consensus in ASEAN is closer to unanimity than the correct understanding of consensus, or the Arabic word mu'afirat, right? Which is really the root of this. So that is why minilateralism is the best way to plug in the gaps, right? And if you look at the history of ASEAN, from the ASEAN Counterterrorism Convention, to the joint patrols in the Malacca Strait, to the trilateral border patrols among Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, we see many cases where minilateralism actually saved the day and proved effective. So I do not buy this argument that minilateralism and multilateralism are mutually exclusive. In my opinion, if you're talking about South China Sea, if you're talking about Myanmar, many extremely inherently divisive issues, I think minilateralism is the only game in town. I hope that was provocative.
Thank you. That was 1 minute extra. Pa Jose Rizal.
Okay. Yes, it's good to be back here again after 3 years. Allow me to talk about the ASEAN and Southeast Asian developments. Perhaps by telling a story about Asian drama. Perhaps you know Asian drama right now as drama in televisions, K-drama and others. But in the 1960s, this is a magnum opus book from a Nobel Prize winner called Asian Drama from Gunnar Myrdal. And then it tells the story about ASEAN, that what in his word about Asia in general, including also Southeast Asia, in his word that this is the locations where the only major change has been the rapid acceleration in the rate of population increase, because it was so dire. The situations in the 1960s, late 1960s, was very devastating. But within less than 50 years, the regions actually already developed very well. And in my opinion, there are three major aspects behind these developments. The first one is the regional stability. The second one is the integrations, the passion for integrations that has been pursued quite intensively among ASEAN countries. And also the third one is the how the regions actually engage with other other countries in the wider regions. From that you can see how ASEAN and Southeast Asia actually shifted several times its strategy toward other major powers. In the Cold War, for example, ASEAN maintains a kind of attitude not being involved too much with the major rivalries. But after the Cold War ended, then instead ASEANs being engaged more actively. This is the times where we've seen several platforms, several initiatives from ASEAN, including also East Asia Summit, ASEAN Plus 3, and in many cases, including also, especially in the economic aspect, they are quite successful. Including also Chiang Mai initiative, for example, or the recent one, the RCEP. And ASEAN actually managed to not only to deal with the major power, but also to serve as a bridge, as a platform for the diverse interests. But of course, the current situation has changed again. So this is also the time for ASEAN to shift its strategy on how to engage with major powers in the regions. That includes also how to deal internally with ASEANs and also how to deal and how to initiative that provide also benefits not only to at ASEAN level but also to individual countries in the regions.
Thank you.
With that, I stop my remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for everyone's opening remarks. So I guess since there is a full room, please raise your hand if you have any questions to the speaker. While we get the mic to the gentleman in checkered shirt, we have listened from our panel that there should be complementarity between ASEAN's own framework and this minilateral, multilateral arrangements and framework, of course. We talk about centrality. What about ASEAN's neutrality? While we get the mic to the gentleman, what about ASEAN's neutrality? Would any of you would like to say something on that? Okay, please.
Yeah, sorry. As I always say, I mean, yes, we don't want to make a choice among superpowers, but not making a choice is a choice in itself, and it has its own costs. And sometimes when we talk about clear cases of violation of international law, clear cases of violation of interests of fellow developing countries or fellow post-colonial nations, to be neutral is to lack principle.
Right.
So I'm sometimes for principled neutrality, but sometimes I see neutrality being used as a cover for actually cowardice and opportunism, right? And I'm not going to name names, but you know which countries I have in mind. But at the end of the day, I'm just saying there are going to be some issues where we unfortunately will have to make some hard choices, right? Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but down the road we have to make those hard choices. And by kicking the can down the road, we're not going to solve it. But yes, as much as possible, we also have to make sure, just like in feminism, you have intersectionality, we also have that in strategic affairs. There are areas where we have more common interests with superpower A, like China, than with superpower B, like United States. And there are areas that is vice versa. So we also have to have a bifurcated, multifaceted approach to this. But as I said, neutrality for the sake of neutrality and not choosing for the sake of not choosing, that's not strategy. That's sometimes cowardice and lack of imagination.
That is cowardice and lack of imagination. Yes, please, your question.
Okay, my name is Iqbal. I'm from Universitas Padjadjaran. Really appreciated that Indonesia during the Thailand chairmanship could push the swift trust within the ASEAN members and counterparts to gaining consensus on AOIP. However, after 3 years, these norms agreed by all countries, ASEAN plus counterpart, or even ASEAN member states still act like there are no norms within the region. So in the midst of Indonesia's chairmanship, should Indonesia's government translate these norms of AOIP into a concrete measure? What kind of measures? What kind of area of cooperations? Or let them be developed as a natural growth, as what we ASEAN scholars always believe with the ASEAN.
Thank you.
Also the second question, should ASEAN accept this kind of multilateralism considering possibilities of Indonesia, Indian-Australia relations, or perhaps current Mafilindo that already supporting the ASEAN mechanism? What kind of challenges and opportunities? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next time, please keep your question brief, but I will invite Pak Michael Tene first on Indonesia's chairmanship next year and how it should treat AIOP and what are the norms and principles that it should, push forward.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I cannot speak on behalf of the Indonesian government. Currently, I am serving as the representative from the ASEAN Secretariat. So I'm not talking about Indonesia's priority and policy as as the incoming chair. But about the AOIP, right? There are several elements within the IOP from various angles you can see. First, in a sense, AOIP is also a reflection of ASEAN centrality. Yeah, I already mentioned what I meant or I understand about what ASEAN Centrality is all about. But look at the AOIP. AOIP is a product of a consensus from all ASEAN. In a way, that is a reflection of ASEAN unity and cohesiveness in crafting a strategic framework with regard to how they face the major power relations in our region. The second point is that the AOIP was crafted by ASEAN itself independently. Again, this is a reflection of ASEAN independency in crafting its policy and views. Yeah? And the third one, the AOIP identify many areas of shared interest with our partners. And that is why the AOIP, the ASEAN is not the one that first invented the term Indo-Pacific or Indo-Pacific strategy, but ASEAN is among the first to articulate and to elaborate what an Indo-Pacific strategy is all about. And I think the AOIP at the minimum informed the other Indo-Pacific strategies that came after that. Yeah? And among all the other Indo-Pacific strategies, the AOIP is the one that can be accepted by all major powers. Everyone from China, Russia, US, Australia, New Zealand, they all support and accept AOIP. This is a reflection of ASEAN centrality in action. Yeah? I think I will stop there about the AOIP. We can elaborate it further.
Yes, let me invite Prof. Gordon Flake and then perhaps Pa Jose Rizal.
So let me be a bit controversial here. In responding to that and both the previous question, there's no question that Southeast Asia is central to the Indo-Pacific. Southeast Asia is geographically in the center of the Indo-Pacific, and it is the focus of almost every Indo-Pacific strategy. The Quad, if you look at the Quad, the reason that the Quad is not a security organization is because it wants to be attractive to Southeast Asia. So AOIP, the UK's Indo-Pacific strategy, Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, India, they're all targeted at Southeast Asia. Now, the question of whether or not ASEAN will be central to the Indo-Pacific depends on what ASEAN does, because the Indo-Pacific is bigger than Southeast Asia. It includes the South Pacific. Does ASEAN have a policy for the South Pacific? If not, it's not central to the Indo-Pacific. It includes, I'm looking at it from Perth, it includes the Indian Ocean. Does ASEAN have a strategy for the Indian Ocean? If not, ASEAN is not central to the entirety of the Indo-Pacific, right? So it really requires ASEAN to step up, to have a bigger review that goes beyond Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia and ASEAN are central to the Indo-Pacific and the focus of the Indo-Pacific. But if you look going forward, it requires more of ASEAN to have true ASEAN centrality.
Thank you. There was two different point of view when you talk about centrality. Bapa Michael Tene speaks about the ability of ASEAN drawing major powers and having a consensus, while Professor Gordon says that even with that, there are still gaps. Before I invite Pa Jose Rizal, is there a question from this wing? Okay, this gentleman. Okay, Pa Jose, please.
Yes, just add a little more about Indo-Pacific, especially the AOIP from ASEAN. I think after 4 years, we did not really see any progress, unfortunately. But I guess AOIP had one advantage or one major benefit to the narrative of Indo-Pacific. It changed the narrative from competitions to cooperation. Because Gordon mentions, explains about the shiftings of terms from Southeast Asia to Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific. Those Asia Pacific terms actually came from a cooperation spirit in the 1990s, while Indo-Pacific unfortunately came from the competitions and a little bit rivalry. But AOIP actually changed the narrative. And nowadays, we see even the US come up with the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, IPEF framework, and also put connectivity, put a lot of common goods and public goods of the regions becomes one of the discussions, part of the discussion. So this is, I think, what Indonesia can pursue a little bit more during its chairmanship to sell the outlook for greater acceptance in the region.
Okay, thank you. Your question, please.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. First of all, my name is Kim. I'm from FBCA chapter UPH. And my question to all of you is that, in your opinion, why do you think India hasn't been keen on increasing their influence and outreach to ASEAN, unlike countries like US or China? Because I think that ASEAN could be a perfect battleground if India would like to counter China's influence given the relationship. So why do you think that's the case? Thank you.
So let me take that. I actually think you're not correct. They have. If you look at the tremendous improvement in India-Vietnam relations, the tremendous improvement in India-Indonesia relationships. Today, we saw a tremendous celebration of the accomplishments of Indonesia at the G20. I would qualify that to say it really was a shared success between India and Indonesia in that forum. And I just want to make a slight difference. I actually view the Indo-Pacific not as a confrontation. I also view it as more about cooperation. You know, we had a problem in the Asia Pacific because as China grew in power and influence, you had two choices. One, to contest that power and influence, which nobody wanted to do. Indonesia doesn't want to do that. ASEAN doesn't want to do that. Or you can expand the region by bringing India in. When you expand the region from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific, everybody in that region is slightly more powerful, including China, including the US, including Japan, including Indonesia, and it becomes more additive. It becomes more cooperative, right? So I never viewed Indo-Pacific as an anti-China move. I always viewed it as more additive because India is already here. And the fundamental question every country in the region has to ask itself, India in or India out? I cannot think of any country, with the exception of one, who does not want India in. And last week we saw something quite shocking. You know, after a week of summitry, we got to APEC in Thailand, and there was one country missing. And not only were they missing, but they were missed. India should be at that table. They should be part of that dialogue. And so we want to pull them in more. So.
Okay. Before Professor Richard takes the floor, is there any female participant who would like to ask question? No? Okay, go ahead, Professor Richard.
I was thinking maybe we can also take multiple questions because sometimes
Yes.
the questions are related, right?
Related,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So more participation.
Yeah, okay, we have one over here. Yeah. And also, perhaps later to Michael Tene, does ASEAN have the capacity to take stronger positions? Yes.
Okay, hello everyone. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Jacinda Bita from President University. Okay, as we know in Indo-Pacific, we know that there are Quad that join this FOIP, which is like US, Australia, Japan, and also India. Before, Professor Gordon said their interest isn't security. So I would like to ask the speaker, what is exactly their interest to promote this framework? Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, one more question, perhaps? Okay, can you please help pass the mic? Thank you. Oh, yeah, you're after that. We'll take multiple questions. Right.
My name is Rafa from Blue Pad Lab. So I would like to ask, okay, is ASEAN really important given that the AUKUS and Quad exist? Because if we want to translate it, that the ASEAN's lacks of assurance to answer several strategic questions, especially about like how ASEAN engage with the Pacific Islands. So how do we expect that the ASEAN will reform? How is there any plan for ASEAN to accommodate or to prevent any minilateralism to happen? Thank you.
So how can ASEAN stay relevant? Yes, we have one more question from, can you help pass the mic? Okay.
Hello, my name is Syarif Darullah. I'm from Universitas Al Muslim Aceh. So I would like to ask, there about information that will be JTF, Joint Task Force, between Andaman and Sabang. It was confirmed in between 2015 and until now, I heard that it will be going JTF Part 2 in December. So how do you think that Indonesia is become the head of ASEAN in 2023? Do you think it will impact the power of Indo-Pacific if Indonesia in 2023 become a head of ASEAN and it can cooperate Indian more into multilateral in Indo-Pacific itself? Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, perhaps while you have the mic, Prof. Richard, there's a question on security agenda and also ASEAN relevance with this minilateral arrangements. And go ahead.
Yeah, actually, just to create more steer here, like I want to push. I mean, let's be honest. A lot about Quad is constraining China. I mean, come on, but for me, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, let's put it this way. I think there's a lot of gaslighting of the West and the Quad as if they are the source of the problem, as if they are bullying the smaller countries in South China Sea, as if they are bullying you in North Natuna Sea. That's not true. Is Quad exporting the kind of surveillance technology, etc., that is spreading authoritarianism? No. So I think this is the problem we have in ASEAN. We do a lot of blaming of the West for whatever there's tension, when in fact, let's realize there's a dialectic going on. And in many times, the West or the Quad, or even India, which is not the West, responds because of the aggression that they're experiencing from certain powers in this region that we'd rather not name, or maybe we can name. So I think that's the one thing you have to keep in mind. So for me, Quad having a kind of a competitive constrainment aspect is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a corrective in some ways. That's why on the AUKUS, actually Philippines supported it, except Duterte, but sometimes the president's terms don't count. So, if you look at it, most of ASEAN was either quietly supportive or openly supportive. And Indonesia kind of tried to make it steer, but they took it back. So it only left Malaysia, right, as the standout. Oh, I want to consult with China and all. But look at it. Let's be honest. We cannot do it on our own. So sometimes it's good for others to do it. But we should not also completely leave it to them to do it. And I think that is why it's more important for us to not only have Quad versus ASEAN, but sometimes have Squad, right? So the idea of Squad was Singapore plus Quad countries, making more and more naval, military intelligence exercises. But my sense is we can have a squad whereby Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, key countries within ASEAN can work with our friends in India, in Japan, in Australia, not necessarily the United States. I mean, during Trump, we had more problem with Trump than with China on a lot of issues here in ASEAN, right? So be flexible. My point is, let's be imaginative. I'm sick and tired of hearing that ASEAN and Indo-Pacific is all about US versus China, including the title of my book. I always put, but that's really for marketing. But let's be brutally honest. If you read my works, I always say, the title puts US versus China, and then you go there, it's actually not US versus China. There are many, many other players. And this is where I want to end on India, and to buttress the point of Gordon, because I kind of tried to contradict him, so let me balance it out. No, the point here is, India is a developing post-colonial nation. It had confidence issues. It had domestic problems for a long time, something that we in ASEAN can completely relate to. I always say India is like Philippines on steroids, right? Dynastic politics, inequality, the drama. And Indonesia is kind of like a medium range between Philippines and India, right? So we can relate to each other. And I think this was a year whereby you had two global stars, Indonesia clearly was the star of this year with G20, with Jokowi going around. I know some Indonesians are not as impressed, but believe me, from the outside, we're happy that finally Jokowi is flexing some diplomatic muscle internationally. But the other one is India. I'm not very supportive of what they've been trying to do around the Ukraine issue. But in fairness, I mean, Jai Shankar, Foreign Secretary of India, is probably the most influencer diplomat. I mean, go on YouTube. It's like, Jai Shankar destroys CNN this. Jai Shankar, it's like Jordan Peterson of diplomacy, right? But, you know what I'm saying? Like, India finally is making it. I mean, finally, India is taking over the narrative and putting a post-colonial narrative like, we're sick and tired of being told which side we should be on. We can make our own destiny. So I may not agree with some nitty-gritties of the arguments here, but I agree with the aspiration. I agree with the strategic intent. I agree with the pizzazz, right? And this is what we need in ASEAN, right? And I think India is much more natural fit for us because their experience as a post-colonial nation, which is finally gaining strategic confidence, is something much closer to what we're experiencing in Indonesia and Vietnam, and hopefully in the Philippines soon, right? All right, under Marcos Jr. Okay, I'll keep it there. Thank you.
Okay, hashtag squad, not quad.
Yeah, squad.
One.
That's the future.
First takeaway. Second, I think the organizing committee should take a commission out of every book that is selling. Okay, Pa Michael Tene, please
Okay,
go
thank
ahead.
you. First, the ASEAN is not the panacea for all the international relations security issues in our region. For all ASEAN member states and all its partners, they have many choices. They have, in terms of foreign policy, you have bilateral choice, you have a regional forum, you have the multilateral forum. And each country will deploy the most effective tools that they have to address those issues. Yeah? So ASEAN is an important tool, but it is not the only one. It's one of the tools available for member states and the dialogue partners. The point here that I want to make is all countries will choose whichever tools most effective to deal with a particular issues. Some issues is best addressed through ASEAN-led mechanism. Some are best dealt with through bilateral, minilateral, or at the international forum. So that is the mindset that I think everyone should have. Now the second, I have already mentioned, give an example why the AOIP is an example of ASEAN centrality. Now I will address the questions about whether AOIP is effective or not. What is AOIP basically? It's to promote cooperation in view of the deteriorating regional situation in terms of major power relations. AOIP is about identifying shared area of common interest. It's based on that shared area of common interest and based on common values, common principles, we bring about everyone to work together, yeah, to address this common interest. Now, the example of how AOIP is in action is actually already there. It's the RCEP. Yeah, the RCEP, ASEAN and its partner identified one areas of common interest, which is economic areas, prosperity. Yeah, the RCEP bring about not only cooperation between ASEAN and its individual partner, but the RCEP brings about the whole dialogue partners participating in the RCEP for them also to work together. For Japan to work with China, for Japan to work with Australia, Australia work with China. Yeah. So RCEP is one example how the AOIP is all about. AOIP identify 4 areas of priorities: maritime cooperation, economic cooperation, achievement of social SDGs, and I forgot the other one. Anyway, so look at the RCEP as an example of how the AOIP is actually being implemented. Secondly, also to address what you have said, Gordon, that the AOIP also emphasizes cooperation beyond the existing ASEAN mechanism. Yeah, they are talking about possibility to work with other sub-regional organizations around the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean on case-by-case basis, on issue-by-issue basis. Yeah, so it opened up. But yes, you are right. For ASEAN, there is a need to articulate more of its strategy, not a common foreign policy, but common framework, broad framework on strategic issues, on maritime issues, on environmental issues, on climate change. this broad framework that can be used by ASEAN member states at a reference point. Just like the AOIP is a reference point in terms of strategic framework on how ASEAN deals with the major power relations in our region. Thank you.
Okay, and after Professor Gordon, perhaps Pak Yose Rizal, would you like to say something on Indonesia chairmanship? Yes, go ahead.
So I'll be short. Really important fact, the Indo-Pacific is no longer controversial. Back in 2018, the Chinese foreign minister said, the Indo-Pacific is like so much sea foam on the waves to be blown away in the wind and the waves, right? But today, not only do we have an ASEAN outlook in the Pacific, but the Europeans and individual countries like Germany and the Netherlands and the UK and France, Canada. I just came here yesterday. I flew in from Korea. Korea was the most sensitive because they did not want to offend China. So Korea did not have an Indo-Pacific strategy. They had a new southern policy which stopped at Indonesia. But last week, or 2 weeks ago rather, in Cambodia, the Korean president articulated an Indo-Pacific strategy, and we're expecting one shortly from Canada. So it's not controversial at all. In fact, I saw something last week I thought was great, 2 weeks ago rather. The Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, wrote a congratulations letter to President Xi Jinping. And he says, congratulations on your re-election as president of China. I look forward to working with you in the Indo-Pacific, which I think is classic Indonesian, right? On the one hand, congratulations. On the other hand, asserting the Australian Indo-Pacific thing. Now, so to go to the specific question, it's really important to note that no country owns Indo-Pacific. The US, the Koreans and others thought this was a US-Japan idea. But success has many fathers. The Indians believe the Indo-Pacific is their ideas. The Aussies believe it's their idea. ASEAN has some claim on it. Japan has some claim on it. But increasingly, it is not controversial. You know, it's really about understanding a broader region and how we work together to make it better. And I'll make one final point. Today, in 2022, the United States and China combined only account for 34% of global GDP. I do not like the idea of G2. In fact, China likes G2, US versus China. I think the US is much more expansive. They like Indo-Pacific because the truth is, the more complex this region is, the more ASEAN is central, the better it is. So I say welcome. If the Brits and the Germans and the Dutch and Canada and Korea want to be part of the Indo-Pacific, that's good because it's more about rules and norms and a system and less about G2.
Yes, Pak, on Indonesia chairmanship and the Indo-Pacific strategy.
On Indonesian chairmanship, I think it's still under discussions at the moment. For sure, there are several agendas. I'm not really representing the government of Indonesia on this, but there are several agendas that might be discussed. One of them is about the Indo-Pacific and how to ASEAN to deal with that. I think it's one of the priority. And another things, it's also about this strengthening the institutions of ASEAN. This is always has been the agenda that Indonesia is trying to promote. And I think the chairmanship would also talk a little bit more about that, although it has been discussed in another forum, high-level panels of ASEAN. I think Indonesia would also try to strengthen the institutional side of ASEAN. And this is going to be very important, I guess, for Indonesia to deal to prepare itself in dealings with all kind of geopolitical shift. Because we have to admit that ASEAN's lack of the mechanisms or to deal with that. And also we have to realize, we have to admit that there are many issues that ASEAN hasn't really dealt with effectively, including also a Myanmar issue, for example. So this is like a very big stumbling block that prevents ASEANs to get or to to do more important role. How comes you can be expected to deal with the greater regions, to over greater regions, if you cannot deal with internal situations? Those would be the discussions or the agenda that Indonesia need to prioritize.
Thank you. Myanmar is also interesting because we also need to protect the rights of our citizens. Do we have any question? Perhaps, after this lady, anyone from this wing or this wing? Okay. Then after that, yes.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to introduce myself first. My name is Ana Juita. I'm from University of Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta. So the question is, if ASEAN is not a finance of international security arrangement, so why do we need ASEAN Centrality? Thank you.
Okay, Pak Michael Tene, do you get the question?
Yeah, well, like I said, I have mentioned the importance of ASEAN and what ASEAN Centrality is all about. I think some speakers already also mentioned, yeah. So ASEAN has an important role to serve, but ASEAN is not the only tools to deal with all the other issues. You know, when you talk about the situation in South China Sea, for instance, yes, ASEAN has a role to that in that promoting a conducive environment between countries, ASEAN countries and China to make sure that the situation remain conducive, stable. But ASEAN is not dealing with the core issue of South China Sea, which is delimitation issues, border issues. It has to be resolved individually by the member concerned with among ASEAN countries. There are border issues in South China Sea. It's not just about between some ASEAN countries and China. Among ASEAN countries themselves, they have not resolved that issues. So the point here is that you have to look at what are the role that can be played by ASEAN and what are the other issues that better served by other policy tools. Thank you.
I think, there's also a question of, I guess, effectiveness of existing forums and framework and whether or not ASEAN should evolve,
So let me say a couple of things here. One, it was interesting over the last 2 weeks of tremendous summit diplomacy. The ASEAN meeting in Cambodia, the G20 here, and then the APEC leaders meeting there. Probably the least high profile and the least effective of those was in Cambodia. And that highlights a problem. And there is a long-standing tension between ASEAN centrality and ASEAN unanimity. And Richard talked about this, right? And the problem with unanimity has become more challenging lately, particularly because of Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar, right? So we talked about Myanmar already, but I just spent 9 days in Vietnam. So before I went to Korea, I was 9 days in Vietnam. Every single conversation I had turned to Laos. My wife is Lao. I love Laos, right? But Laos is kind of like Vietnam's Solomon Islands, right? A country, Australia has had a long-standing, very close relationship, with the Solomon Islands. And if you pick up a newspaper today, you know that we have some fundamental challenges because there's a lot of external influence on the Solomon Islands. The same thing's happening in Laos, and the same thing's happening in Cambodia. And that undermines the ability of ASEAN to have a common policy on security on Myanmar, but also on the South China Seas, right? And so the definition of unanimity is undermined, right? Because ASEAN is not unified on these issues because there are some parties that are really strongly under external influence right now, and I'm just being quite blunt on that.
Okay, before we go to Richard, your question, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, my name is Hino Samuel Jose. I'm from the Ministry of National Development Planning, Republic of Indonesia. And then I would like to ask a question perhaps to all of the speakers that wish to answer this. Hello again, Pak Jose. We met again. My name is Jose as well. Okay, so my question is, I've been reading a lot of journals and I've been writing a journal myself, and I've been identifying a term in which I think this is very interesting indeed. It's the strategic autonomy, because I read one journal back then, I forgot the writer, but I read a narrative that said, okay, in order to attain ASEAN centrality, ASEAN needs to gain its strategic autonomy. Please shed me some perhaps 3 things to do on how to gain this strategic autonomy. especially with the consideration that, unilaterally in each ASEAN member states, we are lacking, unilateral concept on Indo-Pacific frameworks. Even Indonesia, outside from the posisi dasar, buku putih, white paper of the Indonesian foreign policy, we don't have any other specific reference unilaterally. So how to gain that strategic autonomy? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think it relates to what we spoke about, Professor Richard. How can ASEAN get the strategic autonomy? Is there such thing with all the constraints that we have on unanimity and the need, for us to adhere to a non-interference policy, for example?
Yeah, I mean, as far as strategic autonomy is concerned, it's not a binary 0-1 kind of thing. It's 50 shades of autonomy, right? Some countries obviously have more.
That's not a scientific journal, by the way.
Was it? Yeah. No, it's not like, I mean, first of all, let's be honest. As far as the ASEAN as an organization is concerned, I mean, to kind of do my own version of Bilhari, like Bilhari Kausikan, our good friends, says like European Union is like Soviet Union with human rights, right? And I said, if you look at ASEAN as an organization, it's more like a small and medium enterprise without much of a human rights charter, right? The ability of ASEAN as an organization is very limited because how many staff do they have? What is their budget? $200 million? Last time I checked, look at EU. They have hundreds of billions of euros of budget, hundreds of thousands of people, and yet they got Brexit and so many other problems, right? So my point is, our expectation of ASEAN as an organization should be, right, based on the reality of the institutional limitation. That's why I completely agree with Doctor here that we have to have capacity building. But if you look at key members within ASEAN, right, Indonesia has a lot of strategic autonomy. My own country, the Philippines, right? Everyone was underestimating the Philippines, saying, oh, they're just an American lackey. Then Duterte comes and they say, oh, it's a Chinese lackey. And then Marcos comes like, he's playing both of them, right? So if you look at it, actually, we have significant amount of autonomy, not on the same level, but if we can pull it together, work together, especially on issues whereby we cannot get unanimity and consensus, I think we can make a big difference. And this brings me really to the point on Cambodia, Laos, etc. I mean, I feel for our friends there, right? I'm really angry at the Cambodia bashing because if I were Cambodian, honestly, a choice between China, where you get much of your aid, and South China Sea, where I have zero interest, come on. Why should I choose South China Sea? And by the way, what has ASEAN done for me in the Mekong River, where I'm having serious problems? Honestly, what is the Philippines and Indonesia doing for Mekong River basin countries, right? Because they have a huge crisis going on there as far as the dam project by China and Laos and all is concerned, right? So that is why I'm saying, why not look at alternative modalities? You see, we use ASEAN minus X formula very effectively when you got the AFTA CEPT, because there's just no way that you can get unanimity on very complicated issues. So why force Cambodia or Laos to be on board on the South China Sea issue where they don't want to be even involved at all? In fact, Hun Sen literally said that. I'm no fan of Hun Sen, but I get where the guy is coming from. So why not keep it at a much more minilateral level? And I think we can be much more effective on South China Sea. So I'm sick and tired of this cult of consensus. It's a cult that is not delivering us, and it's embarrassing ASEAN when I believe ASEAN can do much better. And let's get rid of this idea that minilateralism is necessarily mutually exclusive. That's what I'm saying. Because for me, at the end of the day, I'd rather have an ASEAN that is autonomous, can do things. But at worst, I'd rather have a beautiful mess in this part of the world than making it a US-China theater alone, right? So keep it there. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That was actually supposed to be my ending, but I'll redo it later on.
Okay, Pa Jose, also, perhaps you would like to say something on the fact that ASEAN may have failed some of the countries, even if it is intended to improve the prosperity of the member states.
Yes, I think the ASEAN autonomy can be looked at as the way ASEANs to be more independent from the influence of the major power and can shape the futures of the regions by itself. But of course, it's not easy. Because one thing for sure is against on the capacity of ASEAN is still very limited. You know that only a fraction of ASEAN activities actually are carried out by the resources from ASEAN. I think I don't know. Pak Michael Tenney perhaps can shed a light on this. More than 90%, around 90% of ASEAN activities are carried out by using the resources from the partners. How can you talk about the ASEAN's autonomy if you don't have your own resources to carry out your interests? So this is one thing that need to be seriously to be addressed, including also under Indonesian chairmanship. The second thing is when we're talking about ASEAN centrality, it is quite effective actually when the partners has their common interests. So ASEAN can serve as the bridge to serve the common interest. But if the partners have different kind of interests to each other, diverse interests, maybe this ASEAN centrality has not really been quite effective. For example, on the RCP, Pak Michael Tenney mentioned about RCP. This is the interest of other partners to go to be in the trade agreements between them. So they use ASEAN in a sense to address this issue. But if they have different interests, including also in security issues, then ASEAN centrality is not effective. Yeah. So ASEAN should offer more on that cooperation, on that kind of issues, that is a bit diverse. Third things that I'd like to mention as well, we always often refer ASEAN as one single entity, although actually ASEAN is far from that. It's not a single entity. Each member countries has their own interests, has their own position and aspiration, and sometimes are often very different to one another. So it is going to be very important for ASEAN to be more appealing toward the domestic interests, and how the ASEAN activities, ASEAN initiative can also be seen bringing benefits for member countries. So not only in terms of the regional benefit.
Thank you. Thank you, Pa. And this is actually a good leeway for our question to Pa Michael Tenney. What is the role of ASEAN Secretariat? How difficult is your job, Pa, in bringing all the member states together, in taking stronger positions? And has there been any discussion for ASEAN to move away from this unanimity, to have, for example, like a voting system, if we're not a homogeneous institution?
Well, the ASEAN Secretariat is, of course, far from what the European Commission is all about. And the first thing you have to remember is that in ASEAN organization, ASEAN Secretariat, it's not a supranational organizations. The sovereignty of member states are intact. Yeah, they are not transferring part of their sovereignty to ASEAN. Yeah. So that is why all the decision made in ASEAN has to be agreed upon by all member states, because none of their sovereignty are being transferred to ASEAN. We don't have that power. The second point is that the Secretariat is evolving. Yes, in the past, the beginning of the Secretariat is simply as a Secretariat to serve meetings, to compile the reports, to prepare some papers requested by member states. Yeah? But of course, over time, the role of the Secretariat enhanced as ASEAN grows. Yeah? But still, I think the overall power is still within the member states. Even the ASEAN Secretariat has no power to represent member states unless it's given on case-by-case basis. Yeah? You may see very little of the ASEAN's Secretary General, for instance, addressing the media or the populations on behalf of ASEAN, because he has no mandate to do that. There are certain issues where member states give the mandate to the Secretariat, to the Secretary General. And of course, he can do anything within that mandate. But in general, all the sovereignty, the responsibility lies with the member states. There is efforts, of course, to increase the capacity of ASEAN Secretariat, but that means more investment from member states. But at the same time, also, we operate based on equal contribution. Yeah. So some member wants to contribute more, but some members are more restricted in terms of the resources available to them. So we have to operate based on the lowest common denominator. But given that overall constraint, we are continue to improve our capacity to serve member states and the dialogue partners. Voting. Yeah, well, I don't think we will go there. Yeah, because like I said, we have to go further deeper. Yeah, what is ASEAN is all about? Why it was developed in the first place? It was developed to make sure that the relationship between countries in Southeast Asia remain peaceful, stable, prosperous. This has been the raison d'etre for ASEAN in the past and continue to be the basis for ASEAN cooperation. So if you go by voting and one of the interests of member states are being undermined within ASEAN, what's the point of having ASEAN? Yeah. So more and more, of course, people are looking from ASEAN from its external relation dimension. But you should not forget that the core interest of ASEAN is internal. ASEAN community is internal matters to make sure that our region remain peaceful. We engage with our partner because we are, of course, aware that maintaining relation between ASEAN countries is not enough. That peace, stability in our region are affected by others as well. That's why we engage them. But our engagement is to help make sure that the impact from whatever things the partners are doing will not affect us very much. So we are all the ASEAN-led regional mechanism. They are not to substitute the UN system. They are not designed to address all the global issues. East Asia Summit, ARF, ASEAN Plus Summit, it is to address the impact of global issues toward ASEAN region, how we can mitigate that, or if there is an opportunity, how we can work to make sure that we can gain opportunity from that. It's not designed to replace the global discussion at the global level on the global issues, or to resolve those issues at the global level. Those mechanisms are designed to how we deal with the impact of the global issues to ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, thank you so much for your questions. I will invite all members of the panel to provide 1 minute closing statement, perhaps beginning with you, Professor Gordon Blake.
Well, thank you. I would just go back to what I said at the very beginning. We are still a region in flux. One of the questions that we were given as panelists is whether or not we needed to have a unified strategy towards ASEAN. I don't think we have that within ASEAN itself. I mean, towards the Indo-Pacific. We don't have that in ASEAN itself or else even in the region. So while Japan may have had a free and open Indo-Pacific, other countries may have free, open, in ASEAN Centrality. The Koreans are likely to add free, open, rules-based, inclusive. The Indians will have free, open, rules-based, included in ASEAN Centrality with flowers and beautiful pictures. We keep adding different descriptions to it, but in the core remains the same. It is that this region benefits from a more additive approach. This region benefits from complexity. This region benefits from inclusivity. And at this point, I do not see the Indo-Pacific as a region or even as a construct which is dividing. I see it as a construct which is inclusive. And so the more Indo-Pacific strategies, the more discussion, the more countries involved in it, the better it is for Indonesia, the better it is for the region as a whole.
Yes.
I have another panel after this, and I think I exhausted my quota of controversial things to say. I had too many quotable because I was like, okay, I'll leave the rest for the next panel. I'll just put it this way. Very quickly. What was I supposed to? No, I know it's a beautiful mess, right? Sometimes we have a lot of frustrations with this part of the world, what we're doing. But my point is this. I'd rather have us muddling through our struggles and trying to find a solution to things as ASEAN, having autonomy towards this issue, having an intent to solve these issues, than leaving the region to be an intramural for US-China competition. I would rather always choose a beautiful mess, but I know we can do better than that, and I hope with East Timor soon becoming a member of this part of the world, we'll also have a policy on South Pacific. I hope that we'll not just say East Timor will make us more vulnerable. Let's help East Timor. Let's do capacity building, and leadership matters, not only in the global stage, but within ASEAN, and that's why I welcome Indonesian leadership, and that's why I still watch my next panel where I discuss Indonesia and ASEAN. Thank you very much for that.
Pak Yose Rizal.
Okay, I start my remark with the quote from Gunnar Myrdal book. Now I would like to end my remark with another quote from another great economist, Angus Madison. He's the economic historian, actually, and he said that until 1800, actually, the 2/3 of the global GDP was contributed by this region, Asia Pacific and India. And after 1800, we knew what happened, because of the colonializations and the instability in the regions. But of course, this is a century for Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific against, and that can be happens if the regions can maintain the regional stability. So ASEANs can provide a lot of things offer a lot of things to maintain this kind of regional stability. But of course, there are a lot of homeworks need to be done at ASEAN level itself. Its engagements with the partners, or many other how it deals with the issues. So that's my closing remark.
Thank you so much. And finally, Your Excellency, Bapak Michael Tene, your closing
Thank you.
statement.
Well, all these questions about ASEAN relevance as ASEAN's centrality, I think it came about because of an over-expectation on what ASEAN can do. And the reason is, as I have alluded earlier, ASEAN was originally designed to manage relationship between countries in Southeast Asia. But more and more, what the main issues that we are facing is actually coming from outside our region. Of course, we have still issues within our region, but more and more the strategic issue we are facing comes from outside our region, or if it originates from our region, it is global in nature. Climate change, environmental issues that cannot be resolved by ASEAN itself. So perhaps we need to take a step back, look at the way the ASEAN cooperation are being designed, and perhaps we can look at how we can better incorporate our external relations into the structure of ASEAN so that we can better manage that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, Your Excellency, Bapak Michael Tene, Professor Gordon Flake, Professor Richard Heydarian, and Bapak Dr. Yose Rizal Damuri. Let's give another round of applause. Thank you so much. And I think there's this expectation on ASEAN, how and will ASEAN deliver on, especially on this Indo-Pacific, we will see. Thank you so much for your participation in this session, and see you in the next session. Thank you. We will take a group photo, however.